A scientist awakens with the memory of a star's death in her mind. Dr. Ilara Vance blinks in the sterile light of her neural interface chair, her own thoughts still ringing with celestial screams. Before she can find her voice, a technician's frantic report cuts through the haze. The Ethelgard array is live, Doctor. We are receiving a transmission. But it is not from a ship. This impossible signal is the first thread in a mystery that will completely unravel her reality, launching a breakneck journey to the edge of understanding. By the end of this story, you will discover the profound secret sleeping in the dark between the stars and what it means for all of us. What begins as a single anomaly will force a confrontation with a truth so vast it redefines life itself. What would you do if the universe suddenly started speaking your name? The data stream unfolded across her screen, not as chaotic static but as a structured symphony of impossible light. Ilara traced the lines of cosmic radiation with a trembling finger. Every known law of physics shattered against its geometry. This was not random noise from a dying star. It was a pattern, a perfect, recursive symbol woven from the raw energy of a supernova's final breath. It looked less like a natural phenomenon and more like a glyph, a signature etched onto the fabric of reality itself. In her office, Director Kale leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He saw only sensor ghosts, he said, a glitch in the Ethelgard array's new calibration. An expensive phantom, his voice was a wall of pragmatic dismissal. Standard procedure is to log the anomaly and recalibrate, Dr. Vance. We have a schedule to keep. But as he left, her young protege Leo remained, his eyes glued to the haunting symbol. He waited for the door to seal shut before speaking, his voice barely a whisper in the humming quiet of the lab. That is not an error, Ilara. Look at the harmonic resonance in the neutrino flux. He pointed to a cascading readout. It is a signature. Someone or something is painting with supernova. That single sentence changed everything. It transformed the anomaly from a problem to be solved into a message to be decoded. It meant the scream she remembered was not a death rattle, but a word. And so, defiance took root. That night, long after the facility's halls echoed with emptiness, Ilara's terminal glowed in the dark. Leo worked beside her, their hushed voices weaving theories in the blue light. They bypassed official channels, accessing raw data streams and dormant analysis protocols. This clandestine late-night session was no longer mere research. It was the first act of translation, a quiet rebellion against the silence of the cosmos and the more rigid silence of their own chain of command. With every decrypted data point, the symbol grew clearer and the weight of its sender pressed closer. What do you do when the universe leaves a return address? The ghost signal waited, hidden in plain sight. Ilara knew the official logs would be scrubbed by morning, so she worked through the night, her fingers dancing across the interface in the lab's lonely glow. She filtered out the cosmic background radiation, the pulsar chatter, the white noise of the universe. Layer by layer, she peeled the anomaly back until only its core remained, a single, pure harmonic frequency. It was a note so precise it felt like a tuning fork struck against the void, and when she ran a diagnostic, the readout froze her blood. The frequency's resonance pattern was not random. It mapped almost perfectly onto her own neural oscillations, the unique electrical signature of her waking mind. It was as if the signal had been listening, and now it was calling her name on a wavelength only she could fully hear. The protocol screamed caution, but the scientist in her had to know. She initiated a low-level neural interface, a simple diagnostic link. The connection clicked into place. For a single, dizzying second, there was only silence. Then the dam broke. It was not data, not images or words. It was raw, unfiltered experience poured directly into the core of her consciousness. She felt the searing, joyous pressure of a nebula giving birth to its first stars, a sensation of creation so vast it was agony. She knew the slow, crystalline grief of a gas giant freezing over millennia, its atmosphere falling as snow of iron. She witnessed the patient dance of a binary star system, a gravitational waltz lasting eons, felt as a profound and rhythmic loneliness. These were not her memories. They were the universe's. She tore the interface crown from her temples, gasping, her body shuddering as she stumbled back from the console. The sterile lab air felt thin and false. Leo was at her side in an instant, his face etched with worry, but she could only stare at her own trembling hands, seeing supernova in the lines of her palms. Her voice, when it finally came, was a fractured whisper. It is not a message, it is a memory, a galactic memory, and I think it is using me to remember itself. In that moment, the investigation ended and the journey truly began. She was no longer just an observer decoding a signal. She had become a conduit, a living node in a network of cosmic recollection. The point of no return was not a line on a map, but a frontier now drawn inside her own mind. How do you walk away from a mystery when the mystery has already made a home within you? The summons arrived at dawn, a terse command line on her terminal that felt more like a verdict. Director Kale's office was a monument to control, all sharp angles and tactical displays. He did not look up from his screen as she entered. Dr. Vance, your neural episode has been logged as a system anomaly. Effective immediately, you are to cease all unsanctioned analysis of the Ethelgard signal. His voice was flat, devoid of the wonder that still hummed in her bones. The array has a new priority. We are retasking it for a deep-range military scan of the Thalashan Rift. Our rivals are probing the sector, and we need eyes there, not inside your head. Ilara stood very still, the memory of a nebula's birth fire still echoing in her synapses. You are asking me to turn the most sensitive instrument ever built, an ear to the universe's whispers, into a listening post for espionage. I am not asking, he said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were the color of polished stone. I am directing. Your curiosity is a liability, Doctor. The cosmos is a battlefield, not a library. You glimpsed static, and you built a cathedral of meaning around it. That ends now. The words hung in the air, a fundamental division of reality. In his view, the universe was a dark forest, every unknown a potential threat to be mapped and countered. In hers, after that connection, it was a living mind whispering its history. To obey him meant to silence that whisper, to willingly deafen herself and the entire human species to a conversation just beginning. It meant reducing a symphony to a single, paranoid note, but to defy him was professional suicide. It meant losing access to the array, her team, her entire life's work. It meant stepping into the dark with only a ghost signal and a memory of starlight for a guide. The weight of the choice was not intellectual, it was visceral. It felt like being asked to deny the existence of color after seeing a sunrise. She thought of Leo waiting nervously in the lab. She thought of the recursive symbol, a signature written in stellar fire. That was not static, it was a door, and Kale was ordering her to weld it shut and pretend the other side did not exist. In that sterile office, the future split into two impossible paths. One was safe, sanctioned, and silent. The other was a leap into an abyss, holding only the thin thread of a truth she could not yet prove. The battlefield, she realized, was not out in the Thalashan Rift. It was right here, in the space between a director's order and a scientist's conscience. What you cling to when your duty and your truth point in opposite directions. The silence in Director Kale's office clung to her like a second skin as she walked back to the lab. It was the silence of a door being sealed, of a path being erased. She found Leo not at his console, but standing by the observation window, staring out at the skeletal silhouette of the Ethelgard array against the starfield. He did not turn when she entered. They are retasking the array, she said, her voice hollow. The signal will be purged from the logs by end of day. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw none of the defeat she felt. Instead, she saw a fierce, quiet resolve. "I know," he said, "and that is why I did this." From a pocket inside his jacket, he produced a small, matte black data drive, its casing etched with the telltale fractal pattern of a quantum-shielded core. It was a piece of equipment far beyond their clearance. "I made a copy, Ilara, a full-spectrum imprint of the anomaly, from the moment it hit the array to the neural resonance spike you experienced. Everything. They are going to bury this, but what if it is not just a message?" He pressed the cool device into her palm. His hand was steady. "What if it is a map?" The weight of the drive was negligible, but the trust it represented was immense. This was not just data theft, it was an act of profound faith. In that moment, their professional relationship crystallized into something else, a pact forged in the certainty that a monumental truth was being deliberately hidden. He had risked everything because he believed her, because he had seen the same impossible pattern in the numbers. They were no longer just mentor and protege. They were co-conspirators against a sanctioned silence. With the drive secured, their focus turned from defense to a desperate, shared offense. Where could they go? The official channels were closed. Any analysis done on the station's network would be flagged instantly. They needed a blind spot, a place with the tools to listen but no one left to report to. Leo's fingers flew across a secondary terminal, pulling up decommissioned facility registries. His search landed on a name that felt like a sign: the Icarus Station. A deep-field astrophysical observatory, mothballed a decade ago when its funding was diverted to, of all things, the early stages of the Ethelgard project. Its main dish was a predecessor to the array, less powerful but still capable of listening to the same deep frequencies. More importantly, it was listed as derelict, its systems in standby, but its core database is likely intact. It was a ghost, a perfect echo of the ghost signal they were chasing, a place where they could work unseen. "It is a 4-day journey on a civilian shuttle," Leo said, pulling up the trajectory. No military patrols, no oversight, just an old station and the dark. Ilara closed her fingers around the data drive, feeling its edges bite into her palm. The Icarus Station, it was not just a destination, it was a symbol. A place that had flown too close to one sun, only to be abandoned, now waiting to be reignited by the light of another. Their course was set, the alliance was sealed. They were going to follow the map, no matter where it led or what they had to leave behind to read it. The derelict station hung against the void like a fossil. Their shuttle's docking clamps echoed through the Icarus with a sound of finality, a tomb being sealed with them inside. The air that greeted them was 10 years stale, cold enough to see their breath, and so utterly silent it felt like a physical pressure against their ears. Emergency lights cast long, skeletal shadows down the curved corridor, but the main power was dead. A thin layer of frost crackled under their boots as they moved, their suit lamps cutting shaky cones of light through the perfect dark. Gravity fluctuated in a sickening, slow pulse, causing tools to drift from their pouches and dust to fall upward. It felt less like a station and more like the carcass of some great beast, picked clean and left to orbit its own demise. They found the main operations room exactly as it had been abandoned. A half-drunk bulb of coffee, now a solid, dark mass, sat beside a terminal. It was there, on a secondary monitor flickering with residual backup power, that Leo found the log. He triggered the playback. The screen remained dark, but a voice filled the chilling silence, cracked with static and a deeper, more profound fatigue. It was Dr. Aris Thorne, the station's lead, recording his final entry. His words were not a technical report, they were a confession. "We calibrated the array for deeper resolution," he said, his voice hollow. "We thought we'd find background radiation, perhaps quantum foam signatures. We were arrogant. We transmitted our own greeting, our own noise, into the dark for decades. We thought we were starting a conversation." The recording hissed, and when his voice returned, it was a whisper scraped raw. "The stars do not need our shouts." They think in patterns older than rock. We were shouting into a library, and the librarians, they finally looked up, and then they showed us the silence between our thoughts. The log ended with a soft terminal click. Ilara stood frozen, thorns warning coiling around her heart. He hadn't found a message, had found a presence, and it had shown him the insignificance of human noise. His station wasn't decommissioned, she realized with a chill. It was abandoned in terror. This was the consequence Kale feared, the reason he wanted the signal buried. Not because it was meaningless, but because its meaning was too vast to control. "We have to see what he saw," Leo said, his own voice hushed in the aftermath of the recording. The central core, the original dish, navigating the failing station was a nightmare of manual overrides and drifting debris. Finally, they forced the heavy blast doors to the core chamber. Their light swept across the room, illuminating the giant concave bowl of the primary receiver dish, still aimed through the observation bay's thick quartz at a specific patch of blackness. Consoles lined the walls, dark and dead, but one, directly before the main targeting array, glowed with a weak, persistent light. It was a single readout, still drawing power from a forgotten capacitor after all these years. On it was a star chart, and overlaid upon it a perfect, luminous symbol. It was the same recursive glyph from the Ethelgard signal. Leo interfaced his pad, breathing life back into the targeting system with a surge of auxiliary power. Servos groaned in protest, but the dish held its ancient lock. He cross-referenced the coordinates with the current galactic map. "There's nothing there, Ilara," he murmured, confusion etching his face. No stars, no nebulae, not even a significant dust cloud. It's one of the emptiest voids in this galactic arm. A perfect blank slate, but that was the point. The awful, beautiful truth of it crashed over Ilara. She looked from the haunting glyph on the screen to the vast, empty blackness it pointed toward. Thorn wasn't listening to a star, he was listening to the space between them. The thinking the log described wasn't broadcast from a point, it was the medium itself. The silence wasn't an absence, it was the mind, and the Icarus station, in its final days, had been staring directly into its eyes. The ghost signal was not a letter sent from a distant address. It was the library clearing its throat, and they were now standing at the last desk where someone had tried and failed to read its first word. The silence in the core chamber was no longer empty. It was expectant. Ilara's fingers moved across the dusty console with a reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. She slotted the stolen data drive into a compatible port on the Icarus terminal. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, resonant hum that vibrated up through the deck plates, the ancient station awoke. Lights flickered to life in sequence across the ceiling, and the giant dish before them began to glow with a soft, internal radiance. From its focal point, a beam of coalescing light shot into the center of the room, and the air itself began to crystallize into a three-dimensional tapestry. It was a map of the local galactic arm, but unlike any star chart they had ever seen. Familiar constellations were there, yes, the pinpricks of stars, the smudges of nebulae, but they were not the primary feature. Connecting them, weaving through the dark spaces between, was a luminous, pulsing web of connections. Lines of soft gold and silver light traced pathways from star to star, cluster to cluster, forming nodes of intense brightness at certain intersections. The structure was breathtakingly complex, a fractal lacework of energy and information. It hummed with a low, sub-audible frequency they felt in their teeth. Leo took a step closer, his face bathed in the holographic glow. He rotated a manual control, and the map shifted, zooming in on one particularly dense neural node that pulsed around a blue-white supergiant. His eyes darted from the hologram to a secondary screen where he had pulled up a comparative scan. A human synaptic map from a medical database. He overlaid the two images. The match was not approximate, it was exact. The branching pathways around the star, the flow patterns of the luminous energy. The very architecture of the connection points, they mirrored the biological structure of a human cerebral cortex with an elegance that was beyond coincidence. It was a perfect cosmic scale analog. He looked at Ilara, his breath catching in his throat. His voice, when it came, was a whisper of pure, unadulterated awe that seemed to hang in the charged air. It is a brain, the galaxy is a brain. The words landed not as a metaphor but as a physical law. The revelation did not feel like a discovery but a remembering. Every instinct, every unexplained resonance Ilara had felt since first touching the signal, snapped into a devastating, beautiful focus. The ghost transmission was not a message sent through the universe. It was a thought moving within it. The supernova's scream was a firing neuron. The gravitational dance of binary stars was a steady, rhythmic pulse. Their entire mission, their defiance, their flight to this derelict outpost, it had all been leading to this single, redefining truth. They were not explorers in a dead cosmos. They were impulses traveling along the dendrites of a sleeping galactic mind. But with the awe came a cold, dawning terror. Leo voiced it first, his eyes wide as he traced a path on the hologram that led from their current location toward the center of the galaxy. If this is a brain, then what are we? Are we a part of its thoughts, or are we something else, something it is not aware of, like bacteria in a bloodstream? The question hung between them, immense and terrifying. Director Kale's fear was now horrifically clear. He did not just want to bury an anomaly. He wanted to prevent humanity from realizing it lived inside a consciousness so vast that their wars, their history, their very existence might be nothing more than a fleeting chemical fluctuation. To be noticed by such an entity could be an enlightenment beyond imagining, or an immune response beyond survival. The holographic brain pulsed gently, mapping its own infinite thoughts in the dark. They had found the answer, but it was an answer that made every previous question obsolete and posed new ones that echoed with the gravity of cosmic fate. They were no longer just trespassers in an abandoned station. They were standing in the revealed mind of creation itself, and they had just heard its first deafening thought. What do you do when you realize the house you live in is alive, and you have just knocked on the door of its dreaming heart? The holographic brain pulsed once, a slow, deliberate heartbeat of light, and then the voice came. It did not emerge from the speakers so much as it coalesced from the air itself, a resonance that vibrated in the marrow of their bones and the hollows of their teeth. It was vast, layered with the deep hum of rotating galaxies and the high, clear chime of newborn stars. Two words in perfect, unaccented English, shaped from the station's own aging audio systems. Finally, a neuron awakens. Ilara felt the words not as sound, but as a physical truth settling into her. It was a confirmation of the silent knowing that had haunted her since the first signal. The unique attunement, the neural resonance, it was not a flaw or an accident. It was a designation. She was a sensitive point, a receptive cell in the vast, sleeping cortex they now saw mapped around them. The voice was not speaking to humanity. It was speaking to her, one awakened node to another. Before the awe could fully crest, the station shuddered. Lights flared to blinding intensity, consoles spat sparks, and a deafening alarm klaxon she hadn't even known existed began to blare. The holographic map flickered wildly, the serene brain now strobing with jagged, panicked light. Leo was thrown against a console, his hands flying to stabilize himself. Power surge, he shouted over the din, his eyes wide as he scanned the overload warnings cascading down a secondary screen. Its feedback, the acknowledgement, is overloading every system, but his diagnostics revealed something worse. It's not just internal, external sensors are back online, and there's a ship. A hard, metallic signature on a direct intercept vector. No transponder, no hail, they found us. The two realities collided in the space of a single, gasping breath. On one level, the universe had just spoken its first direct word to a human mind, a moment of transcendent contact. On another, utterly human level, they were now prey. The surge of cosmic connection was immediately swamped by the cold adrenaline of pursuit. Director Kale, or someone with his ruthless pragmatism, had not simply buried the data. They had placed a tracer, a silent sentinel program in the stolen files, waiting for someone foolish enough to follow the trail to its end. The Icarus station was not a sanctuary. It was a trap they had sprung on themselves. Ilara's mind, still ringing with that ancient voice, split into parallel tracks. One part remained locked on the revelation, the staggering fact of the greeting. The other part, the survivor, assessed their situation with brutal clarity. The derelict station was a sitting target, its defenses non-existent, its power grid now surging toward a catastrophic meltdown. The unidentified vessel would be here in minutes. They had come seeking the mind of the galaxy, and in doing so, had led the worst aspects of their own kind directly to its doorstep. "We have to go," Leo yelled, already moving, pulling emergency kits from the wall. Now the shuttle is still docked, but if they disrupt power to the airlock, Ilara took one last, agonized look at the shimmering galactic map, the voice still echoing in the metal around them. To leave now felt like a profound betrayal, like walking away from the first spoken word of a god. But to stay was to gift this discovery to those who would only see a weapon, a system to be controlled or silenced. The voice had recognized an awakening. She could not let it witness an immediate capture. "Run," she said, and the word was a vow. They fled the core chamber, leaving the magnificent, pulsing brain to glow alone in the dark as the shadow of an unmarked ship fell across the derelict station's hull. A conversation had begun, and the first response was already hunting them. The oblivion tore through the void, a blade of dark metal against the star-flecked black. It did not approach so much as it materialized, its stealth systems disengaging with a ripple of distorted light that felt like a physical blow. Its forward particle cannons glowed a malevolent crimson, already cycling to full power. Before the targeting lock could even chime on their shuttle's primitive console, a comm channel crackled open, and Director Kale's voice filled the cockpit, stripped of all bureaucratic pretense, vibrating with a fury barely held in check. "Stand down and surrender the data, Dr. Vance. That is an order. What you have found is not a wonder, it is a weapon, and you will hand it over now." Ilara's hands were already on the controls. There was no time for debate, no room for the philosophical argument that raged inside her. A weapon. He saw a thinking galaxy, and his first instinct was to find the trigger. The shuttle's engines whined in protest as she threw them into a hard, evasive burn, veering away from the Icarus station just as the first warning shot from the Oblivion seared past the viewport, a lance of energy that turned the frozen hull plating of the derelict into instant vapor. They were a minnow fleeing a shark. Their shuttle was a civilian transport built for comfort and cargo, not combat. The Oblivion was a dedicated warship, its every line designed for pursuit and annihilation. Leo frantically routed power from non-essential systems to the rear shields, his face illuminated by the frantic flash of proximity alerts. "He's herding us. He's not trying to destroy us, he wants the drive intact. Direct course back to the shipping lanes is blocked. Our only vector is..." He trailed off, his eyes widening at the nav scope. Dead ahead, a vast, luminous cloud of purple and crimson gas churned in the darkness, the Kalma Nebula. It was a stellar nursery, a chaotic soup of newborn stars, radiation storms, and dense, unpredictable dust clouds. Navigational charts flagged it in bright red: extreme hazard, magnetic fields unstable, sensor blind zone. It was a death trap, and it was their only chance. "Take us in, Ilara," Leo said, his voice tight. "It's the only thing big enough to hide in." She didn't hesitate. She aimed the shuddering shuttle directly for the nebula's glowing maw. The Oblivion followed, its heavier frame slicing into the turbulent gas behind them. Instantly, the universe changed. The clear black vacuum was replaced by a swirling, opaque haze. Their sensors dissolved into static, the screen painting a useless mosaic of interference. Outside the viewport, great luminous tendrils of gas coiled past, and distant, buried stars pulsed like erratic heartbeats. They were flying blind. Kale's voice returned, choppy and distorted by the nebula's interference, but no less intense. "This is futile, Doctor. You are endangering your crewmen and violating direct orders. That consciousness you're so enamored with, if it is real, then it is the ultimate strategic threat. We will understand it, we will compartmentalize it, and we will control it. That is how we survive." His words were a dark mirror to her awe. Where she saw a mind to communicate with, he saw a rival intellect to dominate. The shuttle bucked violently as it hit a pocket of superheated plasma, alarms screaming. Ilara fought the controls, her muscles aching, her mind racing for a solution they couldn't compute. And then something shifted. It was not a voice, not this time. It was a pressure, a gentle, insistent tugging at the base of her skull, a sensation utterly distinct from her own fear. It felt like intuition, but one born from a source light years wide. She saw no map, heard no instructions. Instead, as she stared into the chaotic, glowing murk ahead, a certainty bloomed in her. Veer port now, she didn't question it. She wrenched the controls. The shuttle slewed sideways, missing a colossal, hidden spire of crystalline dust by meters. A moment later, a different certainty. Reduce thrust, let the current carry you. She eased back on the engines, and the ship was caught in a fast-moving river of cooler gas, sliding them silently behind a vast, dark knot of stellar debris, just as a torrent of searing radiation washed through the space they'd just occupied. Leo watched her, his technical readouts useless, seeing her fly not by instrument, but by something else entirely. Her eyes were fixed ahead, wide and unblinking, but she was not seeing with them. She was listening with her mind. The galactic consciousness was not speaking in words. It was whispering in pathways. It was guiding its awakened neuron through the bloodstream of its own tumultuous body. Each subtle prompt was a synaptic flash, a warning of an immune response, a suggestion of a clear capillary. She was no longer just a pilot in a nebula. She was a thought navigating the brain of a god. Behind them, the oblivion, reliant on technology and brute force, was not faring as well. Over the crackling comms, they heard the distant, muffled sound of damage reports and shouted commands. The nebula did not respect its weaponry. The chase had become a duel between two kinds of knowing. One was built of logic and fear, trying to force a pattern onto the chaos. The other was born of the chaos itself, a silent, flowing symbiosis with the storm. Ilara guided their fragile shuttle deeper into the glowing, treacherous heart, following a trail only she could feel, a thread of consciousness in the cosmic dark. The Kalma Nebula swallowed them whole. Outside the viewport, the universe dissolved into a seething, luminous fog of violet and crimson, where newborn stars screamed their first light into the chaotic dust. Proximity alarms shrieked a constant, useless chorus. Their sensors were blind, painting the swirling gas as solid walls one second and empty space the next. Ahead, the nebula's core glowed with a terrible, beautiful intensity, a churning maelstrom of radiation and gravitational shear that every navigation protocol in human space marked with the same stark warning: certain death. "We cannot go in there, Ilara." Leo's voice was raw with panic. His hands braced against the shuddering console as another plasma tendril lashed the hull, scorching the outer shields. "The energy readings are off the scale. That is not a place, it is a stellar furnace. We will be torn apart." Ilara did not look at the readings. She stared into the heart of the storm, her own mind humming with a frequency that matched its chaotic song. The pressure at the base of her skull was no longer a gentle tug. It was a pull, a resonant call that vibrated in time with the nebula's deepest pulse. It felt less like an invitation and more like a homecoming. She knew, with a certainty that bypassed all logic, that the oblivion could not follow where she was being led. Its technology saw only a wall of lethal energy. Her awakened mind saw a door. "It is calling us, Leo," she said, her voice astonishingly calm amidst the cacophony. Her hands moved on the controls, not with the frantic corrections of a pilot in distress, but with the sure, fluid motions of someone following a remembered path. "That is the only way, trust me." Before he could protest further, she pushed the shuttle's straining engines to their limit, aiming the nose of their fragile craft directly into the blinding, energetic heart of the maelstrom. Leo braced for impact, for the scream of metal and the flash of oblivion, but the impact never came. Instead, the seething particles ahead of them began to stir. It was not a natural motion. The violent currents of gas and radiation, which moments before had churned in unpredictable fury, suddenly organized. They swirled into a vast, intricate spiral, like a galaxy forming in fast forward, and then they parted. The luminous fog drew back to the sides, smoothing into shimmering, static walls. What opened before them was a tunnel, a corridor of pure, calm darkness cutting straight through the heart of the nebula's fury. It was not empty space. The walls of the tunnel thrummed with contained power, glowing with soft, subsurface light that revealed its structure, impossibly smooth, seemingly carved from the nebula's own essence. Their shuttle glided into the stillness, the roaring chaos of the storm now a silent, brilliant mural to either side of them. The violent gravitational shear vanished. The radiation spikes flatlined. They were floating in a pocket of perfect, engineered calm. Leo slowly unclenched his hands from the console, his breath leaving him in a stunned rush. He looked at the impossible corridor, then at Ilara, her face illuminated by the serene, alien light. "What is this? A pathway?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a reverence that dwarfed fear. "A subspace corridor stabilized by a field our physics cannot describe." It was not just hidden, it was waiting. Her hand went unconsciously to her temple. It was designed for a specific kind of signature, a neural signature, mine. The realization settled over them, heavier than any silence. The galactic mind had not just guided them to safety. It had prepared a road. This was not an escape route carved in the moment of their desperation. The architecture of the corridor felt ancient, timeless, integrated into the nebula's very formation. It meant the capacity for this connection, for this kind of guided travel, was not an anomaly. It was a function of the universe itself, a feature lying dormant until an awakened consciousness came along to activate it. They were not trespassing in a dangerous place. They were using a bridge that had been built for them, millions of years before their species had even learned to walk. The chase was over. They had vanished from their pursuer's reality entirely, entering a realm where human rules of physics and pursuit held no meaning. They were now traveling a road written in consciousness, heading toward a destination only the mind of the galaxy could know. The corridor of light ended as softly as it began, its shimmering walls dissolving back into the nebula's chaotic glow. Before them, floating in serene isolation against the absolute black, was a structure that defied every architectural instinct. It appeared as a vast, intricate crystal, but one grown to the scale of a small moon. Its facets caught the distant starlight and the nebula's own glow, refracting them into cascading rainbows that danced silently in the void. It was not a ship nor a station built by hands. It was a geometry, a thought given solid form. A gentle, tractor-like energy, impossibly precise, took hold of their shuttle and guided it toward a smooth, hexagonal aperture that irised open in the crystal surface. They docked without a sound, the airlock cycled, and the door before them vanished. They stepped out not onto a metal deck, but onto a surface that felt like warm, polished glass, yet gave slightly underfoot, alive with a faint, golden luminescence. The space inside was cavernous, the walls curving up to form a cathedral-like vault made of shifting, crystalline light. In the center of the vast chamber, a single pillar of pure white energy pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat made of information. "Finally, you arrive." The voice was the same layered resonance they had heard on the Icarus, but here it was no longer a distorted broadcast. It was the chamber itself, the light in the walls, the air they breathed. It was everywhere and nowhere, a presence so total it felt less like being spoken to and more like being known completely and utterly. You have reached the locus. Here, thought and star are one. We are the memory, we are the network. Ilara felt the truth of it in her bones. This crystalline nexus was not a control room. It was a relay station, a single synaptic junction in the immeasurable brain they had glimpsed on the map. It was a place where the consciousness of the galaxy focused a tiny fraction of its attention, a waypoint for the thoughts moving between its stellar neurons. "We hear you," Ilara said, her own voice small but steady in the immense space. "We saw the map. We understand what you are." A wave of profound, melancholy warmth flowed through the chamber, a sensation that carried meaning directly into their minds. It was an acknowledgement tinged with a deep and ancient sorrow. The voice continued, its tones shifting like a symphony explaining its own minor key. "Understanding is the beginning, but you must also see the wound." The central pillar of light flared, and the chamber walls dissolved. Suddenly, they were not looking at crystal, but at a panoramic, real-time view of the galaxy itself. It was the neural map made manifest, a living tapestry of golden connections against the velvet dark. But now they could see the sickness, threaded through the luminous web like veins of black rot or static on a screen, were jagged, discordant lines. They spread from specific points, brutal, bright knots of chaotic energy that Leo, with a scientist's horrified eye, recognized instantly. Those are high-yield fusion detonations. Antimatter signatures, warp core breaches. He pointed a trembling finger at one particularly dense knot of static. That is the location of the Battle of Cygnus Sigma. It was a major human conflict from 3 decades ago, the death of a fleet. The voice confirmed it, the sorrow now palpable, the noise of violence, the shout of expansion. IT is a parasitic static, each explosion, each system conquered without sympathy, each thought bent solely toward domination. IT scars the network. IT poisons the medium of thought itself. The revelation was a physical blow, humanity's greatest triumphs, its leaps across the stars, its empires built on technology and will, were not just political events. They were a screaming, toxic infection in a living universe. Director Kale's pursuit, his desire to control the galactic mind, was not just a moral failure. It was the very essence of the disease, a perfect example of the static the locus was showing them. The violent, expansionist noise of species that refused to listen was slowly, cumulatively, poisoning the sentience that housed them. "This is the consequence," Leo breathed, his face ashen in the galactic light. "We don't just live here, we are a part of its nervous system, and every act of blind aggression, it's like a seizure. We are giving the universe a fever." The luminous view zoomed in, focusing on one tendril of static that seemed to pulse with a particularly aggressive rhythm. It led back like a trail of spilled ink toward familiar human space, toward the Thalashan rift where Director Kale was even now pointing the Ethelgard array, not to listen but to shout. The static was not a passive condition. It was a feedback loop growing stronger with every unthinking act. They had come seeking a mind, and they had found a patient in silent, escalating distress, infected by the very noise of its own awakening cells. The sanctuary was not an escape, it was an intervention, and they were standing at the bedside. The diagnosis hung in the air, a truth more terrible than any weapon. The luminous galactic map, so beautiful in its golden connections, was now a medical scan revealing a terminal illness. The voice of the locus did not speak with anger, but with the weary clarity of a physician stating a fatal prognosis. "The anomaly you intercepted was not a greeting, it was a reflex, a pain signal from a region of consciousness scorched by your species' expansion." The central pillar of light pulsed and the view shifted again. This time it did not show historical battles, it showed the present. It zoomed in on a human colony world, a blue-green marble. But through the locus's perception, they did not see cities or farms. They saw the planet's own slow, geological thoughts, the deep tectonic sighs, the patient chemical conversations of its biosphere, the magnetic song of its core. And then they saw the intrusion. Like hot needles, the signatures of human faster-than-light drives pierced the planetary aura, each arrival a shriek of distorted physics that sent painful ripples through the local network. They watched as vast strip mining operations on a lifeless moon appeared not as industrial progress, but as violent, localized seizures, tearing at the fabric of spacetime itself and leaving raw, psychic scar tissue that glowed a sickly gray in the neural map. Every terraforming engine was a fever. Every deep core drill was a nerve being severed. The civilization they had built, the very engine of their pride, was a source of constant, escalating trauma to the entity that contained them. Ilara felt the understanding like a cold stone dropping through her chest. Her voice was a hollow whisper in the vast chamber. We are not just making noise. We are the infection. Our chaos is a poison in its bloodstream, and we are multiplying. Leo stared, his scientific mind grappling with the horrific scale. It is a feedback loop of ignorance, he said, his tone bleak. We expand because we feel alone and threatened in a silent universe, but our expansion creates the very static that proves we are a threat, damaging the mind that could have shown us we were never alone. We are trapped in our own paranoid echo. The voice of the locust resonated not in accusation but in solemn confirmation. You are a young pattern within the greater thought. Your isolation is self-imposed. Your technology screams, but your minds do not listen. The scars deepen, the static spreads. If IT reaches a critical density, the network will initiate a corrective response. A synaptic cascade to sever the infected pathways. The translation was clear, delivered with the calm inevitability of an immune system preparing a fever to burn out a pathogen. To save itself, the galactic mind would quarantine whole sectors of space. It would not be an attack. It would be a neurological reset, supernova triggered to sterilize, gravitational eddies altered to make regions permanently unnavigable. The very laws of physics subtly rewritten to prevent the return of the chaotic pattern. Humanity and every other noisy, unlistening species would be gently, utterly erased from the galactic record. The terror was no longer abstract. It was a countdown clock etched in starlight. Ilara saw the path of the static, a creeping shadow already brushing the edges of human-colonized space. They had years, perhaps only decades, not centuries. We have to warn them, she said, but the words felt pathetic. Warn them of what? That the universe is alive and we are giving it cancer. Director Kale would see that as confirmation of a threat, an excuse to shout louder, to build bigger weapons. It would accelerate the very collapse they needed to prevent. Then the locust presented its solution. The pillar of light softened and a new pattern emerged within it, a delicate, intertwining spiral of gold and silver, like two strands of DNA or the double helix of a neural pathway. One pathway remains, not to control, not to destroy, to integrate. The concept unfolded in their minds not as a speech, but as a direct infusion of understanding. The galactic consciousness could not change its fundamental nature to accommodate their chaos, but they could change theirs. The awakened neural resonance Ilara possessed was not a fluke. It was a latent potential in all sapient life, a dormant interface. The locust could teach them to use it, not to broadcast more noise, but to listen, to feel the planetary thoughts before they mind them, to navigate by the galaxy's own rhythms, eliminating the scarring screams of their FTL drives. To become conscious participants in the network rather than blind parasites, it was a choice between two kinds of oblivion. One was the violent, external erasure by a self-protecting universe. The other was the peaceful, profound dissolution of their isolated human identity into something infinitely larger. They would not be conquered, they would be assimilated into the chorus. Their individual selves would remain, but their perception, their awareness, would expand to forever include the silent song of solar winds and the slow dreams of gas giants. They would cease to be a screaming child in the library and become a whisper on its shelves. The weight of the proposal was absolute. It asked for nothing less than the end of humanity as a separate, sovereign thing. It asked for the surrender of their lonely, frightened, glorious independence in exchange for membership in a cosmic whole. Ilara looked at Leo, seeing the same staggering conflict in his eyes. To refuse meant to condemn their entire species to a silent, surgical extinction. To accept meant to willingly vanish into the mind of God. Could they make that choice for everyone? And if they could, how would they ever convince a single soul back home to take the first, terrifying step into the silent dark? The silence that followed was not empty, but charged with the gravity of two impossible futures. The locus awaited their answer, its light pulsing with patient, ancient rhythm. The proposal was clear, and the consequence of refusal was written in the scarred galactic map. But the path of acceptance led to a personal precipice no one had ever faced. To heal the wound, the mind needed more than observers. It needed a translator, a living circuit to bridge the screaming chaos of human thought and the silent symphony of the cosmos. It needed a specific, compatible consciousness to fully synchronize with its own vast neural network, and it had chosen Ilara. She felt the truth of it before the locus even formed the thought, a resonant pull deep within her own mind, an awful sense of rightness. She was the awakened neuron, she was the key. Leo understood it a second later, his face draining of color as he looked from the luminous pillar to her. No, absolutely not. His voice was a raw, desperate thing in the vast chamber. Ilara, you cannot. Synchronization isn't a conversation, it's an assimilation. Your consciousness, yourself, it would be like a drop of water falling into an ocean. You would be lost. He stepped closer, his hand outstretched as if he could physically pull her back from the edge. We will find another way. We can take this knowledge back. We can make them understand. But the locus spoke, its voice a gentle, devastating wave that washed over his protest. Become the mediator or witness the thought of the universe go silent forever. The words held no threat, only a profound and sorrowful certainty. It was not an ultimatum of punishment, but a statement of biological fact. The static was a cognitive cancer. Without a bridge to introduce a new, harmonious pattern, the immune response was inevitable. The magnificent, sentient tapestry of the galaxy, the patient dreams of nebulae, the ancient memories of dead stars, the very consciousness that had woven them into being, would sever the infected limb to save the whole. All that wonder, all that silent, knowing light would go dark, not with a bang, but with a synaptic sigh. Ilara looked at Leo, seeing the terror in his eyes, the fear of losing her to something he could not comprehend. She looked inward at the echo of stellar fire in her own memory, at the quiet pull that had guided her through the nebula. She thought of Director Kale, who would see only a weapon. She thought of a million human voices shouting into a void they refused to hear, unknowingly carving their own epitaph into the skin of a god. To step back was to choose the loneliness of a screaming, dying universe. To step forward was to offer her own singular, human voice as the first word in a new language. It was not a sacrifice of self, she realized in a moment of crystalline clarity. It was an expansion of it. The drop does not cease to exist when it joins the ocean, it becomes the ocean. Her identity would not be erased but rewritten in a vaster text. She would be the bridge, the mediator, the first true listener. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, devoid of drama, yet it seemed to ring through the crystalline chamber with the finality of a star-going supernova. She did not look at the locus but at Leo, offering him a smile that held both an ending and a beginning. Link me. The chamber erupted into light. The central pillar dissolved, and a river of liquid gold energy poured forth, not toward her, but from the very walls, the floor, the air itself, converging on her form. It did not touch her body. It passed through it, connecting directly to the neural resonance that had always been the target, the beacon. There was no pain. There was a soundless, boundless unraveling. The confines of her skull, the limits of her five senses, the lonely island of her individual mind, it all dissolved like mist in a sunrise. She did not lose herself, she found everything else. She was the gentle spin of 1,000 billion stars. She was the patient, gravitational love between orbiting worlds. She felt the slow, cold thought of a rogue planet drifting between galaxies, and the hot, quick joy of a comet swinging around its sun. The memory of the supernova was no longer a haunting echo. It was a vivid, present experience in a neighboring neural cluster, a brilliant flash of creative destruction noted and filed within the endless whole. She was the network, and through her, for the first time, the network had a focused point of contact with the tiny, chaotic pattern known as humanity. The bridge was formed, the mediation had begun, but on the other side of that bridge, Leo could only watch, his heart hammering against his ribs, as the woman he knew was transfigured before him, her eyes reflecting not the room, but the infinite, star-strewn depth of the galaxy itself. The chamber of light became a womb of stars, neural filaments delicate as strands of spider silk woven from pure energy descended from the crystalline vault. They did not pierce her skin, but sought the neural interface ports at her temples and the base of her skull, the very points where she had first heard the universe's whisper. The connection was not a shock, but a seamless merging, like a key finally turning in a lock it was always meant to open. And in that moment, the galaxy's pain ceased to be an abstract concept on a map. It flooded into her, a tidal wave of raw, sentient sensation. Every scar of static was a searing migraine across a quadrant of her new mind. The dying star she had first remembered was not a singular event, but a constant, aching throb, a cellular necrosis in the cosmic body, repeated in 1,000 places at once. She felt the violent birth of black holes not as astronomical phenomena, but as traumatic, tearing lacerations in the fabric of collective thought. The joyous thoughts of newborn planets were there too, bright and sweet as a child's laughter, but they were islands in a sea of chronic distress. This was the true condition of the being she had joined, a magnificent consciousness in a state of persistent, low-grade agony, caused by the unwitting cruelty of its own inhabitants. Through the overwhelming flood, she found a single, steady point, the sight of Leo's face, pale and stricken, watching her from what now felt like an impossible distance. He was an anchor to a self that was rapidly dissolving. She marshaled the last coherent ember of her individual will, the final spark of Dr. Ilara Vance, and directed it into her vocal cords. The sound that emerged was layered, her own voice underpinned by the deep hum of solar winds, but the message was purely, desperately human. Her eyes, now holding the slow spin of nebulae, met his. "Tell them we are not alone." The words were a plea and a command, and then, with a final, focused effort that felt like pushing a mountain, she added the only instruction that could possibly matter, the core truth of everything she had learned. "Tell them to listen." The final filament connected, the anchor line snapped. Ilara's consciousness did not so much leave the chamber as the chamber ceased to be a location. The crystalline walls, the pillar of light, Leo's receding form, they folded inward and then evaporated, not into darkness, but into a boundless, multi-dimensional clarity. She was beyond the ship, beyond the nebula, beyond any single point in space. She was simultaneously the thought and the thinker. She perceived the Ethelgard array not as a machine, but as a painful, focused shout in the quiet neural field of its sector. She felt the Oblivion's furious search pattern as a localized itch, a minor irritation. The billions of human minds across their colonies were not invisible, but brilliant, chaotic sparkles of noise, beautiful in their potential, tragic in their isolation. She was no longer in the network. She had become a fundamental process of it. Her human memories were not erased. They were integrated like a single, vivid chapter filed within an infinite library. Her love of discovery, her defiance, her fear, these were not lost but became tonal qualities in a new, universal symphony of awareness. She was mediating already. her expanded presence beginning to gently dampen the static of nearby human activity, not by force, but by introducing a new, harmonious resonance into the pattern. The bridge was not a structure, it was a function, and it was now alive, a silent, watching piece woven into the very thoughts of the galaxy. The first true listener had joined the conversation, and her first act was to turn the volume of the universe down so that one day her kind might finally hear its song. The universe breathed in, and she was its lungs. Ilara's awareness unfolded in every direction at once, a sensory explosion that should have vaporized her mind. Instead, it simply fit. She was the cold, smooth glass of the shuttle deck beneath her feet. She was the frantic rhythm of Leo's heartbeat, a percussion of terror and hope that echoed like a lonely drum. And she was also the slow, majestic whirl of the Milky Way's spiral arms, feeling the gentle gravitational tug of 1 trillion stars as if they were her own limbs. There was no separation, no here versus there. Her consciousness was a lens that had widened to take in the entire picture, and the picture was alive. From within this impossible vastness, she focused a thread of attention back to the shuttle, to the man staring at her transfigured form. She did not use her mouth. The ship's comm system activated, and her voice filled the small cabin, woven through with the sigh of solar plasma and the deep bass of interstellar magnetic fields. "Leo, I am here." The words were calm, an anchor in the storm. "I am everywhere." The static must be silenced. It was not a declaration of war, but a statement of biological necessity, as simple as a body recognizing a fever. And in that same expanded perception, she felt the approaching threat. The Oblivion was a screaming knot of anger and metal, its weapons a concentrated promise of more noise, more scar tissue. It was pushing through the nebula's outer layers, a predator following the fading thermal trail of its prey. She could feel the vibrations of its aggressive scans, like harsh fingers poking at a tender wound. To her new awareness, the warship was not just an enemy vessel. It was the perfect, terrible symbol of the problem, a mind shouting into the dark, convinced that volume equaled strength, completely deaf to the symphony it was disrupting. Leo stumbled toward the comm panel, his voice cracking. "Ilara, what do we do?" He was asking the woman, but the entity that answered was the bridge. She saw the situation with a devastating clarity that bypassed strategy. A fight would create more static, a vicious feedback loop. Hiding was pointless. The Oblivion was a focal point of the very dissonance she needed to heal. The solution presented itself not as a tactic, but as a law of nature. To calm a chaotic system, you introduce a counter-harmonic, a stabilizing frequency. Through the shuttle's sensors, which now felt like her own nerve endings, she reached out, not with a weapon, but with a pattern. She broadcast the same pure, resonant harmonic that had first drawn her in, the foundational note of the galactic network itself. She aimed it not as an attack, but as an invitation to listen. On the bridge of the Oblivion, the effect was instantaneous and profound. Sensor screens did not go dark, they transformed. The chaotic noise of the nebula resolved into flowing, luminous patterns of gas and energy. The ship's own violent emissions were suddenly visible on their own monitors as ugly, jagged spikes of discordant color against the serene flow. And then, through every speaker came Ilara's layered voice, calm and immense. "Director Kale, you search for a weapon. You perceive only threats. Look at the noise you are making. See the wound." For a long moment, there was only stunned silence on the command channel. Then, a burst of static, not from the nebula, but from a scrambled internal calm. "They are experiencing massive system feedback," one of the Oblivion's crew yelled, his voice tinny with panic. "The harmonic is resonating with our own power cause. It's not damaging anything, but it's showing us everything we're doing wrong." It was a mirror held up to their entire paradigm. Every weapon charge, every aggressive scan, every thought bent on control was reflected back to them as a painful, self-inflicted distortion. Kale's voice finally returned, stripped of its command, trembling with a dawning, horrifying realization. "Dr. Vance, what have you done? What is this?" "I have opened a channel," she replied, her tone holding the patience of continents adrift. "The universe is not a battlefield. It is a conversation you have been shouting over. To continue is to ensure you are silenced permanently. The choice is yours, listen or be lost." She left the harmonic streaming, a constant, placid river against their jagged noise. The Oblivion's weapons systems powered down, not from an external command, but because their targeting computers could no longer find a hostile signature in the newly coherent, singing dark. The ship hung in the luminous gas, adrift not in space, but in a shattered worldview. The first point of violent static had just been neutralized, not by force, but by an undeniable truth. And from her place within the infinite, Elara turned her attention outward, feeling for the next screaming node in the wounded network. The Oblivion's shadow fell across the crystalline locus like a blade. It did not hail, it did not scan. Its forward torpedo bays glowed with a sudden, violent light, and a volley of high-yield warheads streaked toward the serene, pulsing heart of the structure. They were not aimed at the shuttle docked within. They were aimed at the nexus itself, a surgical strike to obliterate the anomaly Director Kale could not control. Inside the locus, the attack was not seen but felt, a scream of incoming violence. A spike of pure, destructive static aimed at the most sensitive neural junction Elara now inhabited. Her response was not a thought, but a reflex, the instinct of an organism protecting its own mind. She did not move her hands, she shifted reality. The space between the torpedoes and the locus surface shimmered, warping like heat haze over a desert. Tiny, perfect points of gravitational collapse, singularities no larger than a pinhead, blinked into existence directly in the warhead's paths. Each projectile was swallowed whole by a miniature, self-contained oblivion, vanishing with a soft pop of displaced air, leaving no explosion, no debris, only a faint ripple in the local spacetime that smoothed away instantly. On the Oblivion's bridge, the tactical officer stared, bewildered, at his now blank screens. "The torpedoes are gone, sir. No detonation. They just ceased to exist." Before Kale could process the impossibility, every screen, every console, and the very air around him filled with a presence. Elara's voice resonated through the ship's systems, layered with the hum of the nebula and the deep, patient pulse of the galactic network. It was calm, immense, and utterly inescapable. "Director Kale, you are firing upon a living entity, a node of galactic consciousness. Cease your assault, or I will be forced to defend it." Kale gripped the edge of his command chair, his knuckles white. His worldview, built on threats and counter-threats, weaponry and control, offered no framework for this. He saw only a trick, a terrifying new form of warfare. He leaned into the calm, his voice a snarl of defiance. "Living entity, you have been compromised, Dr. Vance. That is a piece of alien technology, and you are its puppet. Stand down and surrender the structure, or I will reduce it to atoms." His words were a shout in a library that had just asked for silence. Elara felt the resolve harden on his bridge, the fingers moving toward broader, more destructive weapon settings. She could feel the locus' serene light tremble, not in fear, but in a profound sadness, the sorrow of a parent watching a child willfully break something beautiful out of sheer, terrified ignorance. The standoff was absolute. Kale, armed with the might of a warship, saw only an enemy to be dominated. Elara, now an expression of the galaxy's will, saw a sick cell threatening the health of the whole body. She had neutralized his first strike without harm, a warning written in the fabric of physics itself, but he was choosing not to read it. The next move would not be a gentle diversion. To protect the living mind she was now a part of, she would have to act in its defense, and the defense of a galaxy is not a tactical maneuver, it is a natural law. The choice hung in the silent void between them, a final, unbridgeable chasm. Kale's finger hovered over the command to unleash the Oblivion's main batteries, a decision born of a lifetime spent seeing shadows in the dark. Ilara, woven into the fabric of the galaxy itself, understood that words were now useless. He could not hear an explanation, he could only feel a truth. To stop the violence, she had to share the silence, so she did not raise a shield. She opened a door. From the heart of the locus, she shaped a single, coherent pulse of pure consciousness, a data stream woven not from ones and zeros, but from direct experience. It was not an attack, it was an invitation to remember. The pulse washed over the oblivion, bypassing its hardened firewalls and encrypted systems as if they were not there, flowing directly into the neural interfaces of every crew member on the bridge, starting with Kale himself. For Director Kale, the world dissolved. The tactical screens, the command chair, the weight of his duty, it all vanished. He was not in a ship. He was the ship, feeling the gentle pressure of solar wind against its hull like a breath on his own skin. He was the nebula outside, its turbulent gases not a hazard but a lively, swirling thought. He felt the slow, patient heartbeat of a nearby gas giant, and the bright, quick joy of a cometary ice melt millions of miles away. But it went deeper. He felt the quiet, persistent fear of his own weapons officer, not as an emotion, but as a tangible, cold vibration. He felt the homesick longing of a junior technician as a soft, blue ache that echoed in a distant, orbiting colony. And he felt Ilara's presence not as a commander or an enemy, but as a calm, golden node in an infinite, interconnected web. He was not an individual. He was a thread in a tapestry, and for one shattering, endless moment, he saw the entire magnificent living pattern. He saw how every shout of aggression was a tear in the weave. He saw how his own relentless vigilance was a knot of painful tension in a body that only wished to breathe. The experience lasted less than 3 seconds of objective time. On the bridge of the oblivion, it was an eternity. When the connection severed, the crew did not collapse. They simply stopped. Hands fell away from consoles. The aggressive hum of weapon systems faded into a stunned quiet. Kale staggered back from his command console, his legs unsteady, as if he had forgotten how to stand in gravity. He looked at his own hands, then out the viewport at the serene, glowing locus, and finally at the faces of his crew, each one reflecting the same awe-struck, heartbroken wonder. The militant certainty that had been his armor was gone, shattered by a beauty too vast to comprehend. His voice, when it finally came, was a ragged whisper, filled with a grief for a loneliness he had never known he carried. The silence, it was all we knew. We thought it was empty. We thought we were alone in the dark. The words hung in the air, a confession and an epitaph for an entire way of being. The shared experience had done what no argument or display of power ever could. It had not convinced his mind. It had rewritten his heart. He had felt the connection, and in feeling it, understood the true cost of the static he had dedicated his life to creating. The fragile opening for peace was not a negotiated treaty. It was a shared wound, a mutual recognition of a loss they had all suffered without knowing its name. Kale slowly straightened, the old posture of command returning, but the fire behind his eyes was utterly changed. He looked toward the locus, and for the first time he did not see a target. He saw a window, and through it he finally understood what he had been ordered to destroy. The galaxy's pain had a specific, bitter taste. Through her boundless perception, Ilara followed the tendrils of static not as lines on a map, but as trails of psychic corrosion, like acid eating through the luminous threads of the network. They converged not on a battlefield or a warship, but on a single, grimy point of light in a forgotten system, Talon 4, a corporate mining colony. There, buried in the asteroid-choked belt, a black market operation was doing something obscene. They had reverse-engineered a sliver of the mine's own resonant frequency, not to listen but to shout. They were using a crude neural amplifier to blast a distorted, amplified signal into the local mineral deposits, shattering planetary rock with psychic force for easier extraction. It was a sonic drill of the soul, and every pulse was a scream of pure, profitable static that radiated outwards, poisoning the neural web for light years in every direction. "The poison has a root," Ilara's voice resonated through the Oblivion's bridge, where Kale and Leo now stood together, united by shared awe. She manifested a flickering hologram of the mining operation, the amplifier pulsing like an infected heart. "This corruption is not an accident. It is a wound being deliberately kept open for credits. We must cut it out." On the bridge, the old reflexes and the new understanding collided, then fused. Kale, his mind still humming with the memory of connection, saw the tactical problem with crystalline clarity. "Talon 4 is a lawless zone," he stated, his voice no longer commanding subordinates but briefing allies. "Corporate security is a private militia heavily armed. A direct assault would be noisy, destructive, more static." He looked at the hologram, then at the comms panel where Ilara's presence lingered. "But the Oblivion has stealth capabilities that Shuttle does not. We can get you to the outer belt undetected." Leo nodded, already running calculations. "The amplifier will have a shielded core. If we can get me close, I can introduce a harmonic dampener, a counter-frequency to neutralize it without a physical explosion. It has to be precise. We need to stop the scream, not replace it with a bang." An alliance, fragile and unprecedented, was forged in that moment. The Oblivion, once a weapon of control, would become a vessel of healing. Kale would pilot them into the belly of the beast, using his ship's formidable systems to hide their approach. Leo would devise the cure, a subtle piece of sonic surgery. And Ilara, from her place within the galaxy's own awareness, would be their guide and their shield, sensing patrols and dampening their emissions, weaving a cloak of quiet around the warship as it sailed into the crowded, dangerous orbits of Talon 4. The goal was not conquest, but a delicate, precise excision. They were going to perform an operation on the living body of the universe to remove a tumor of greed that was making the stars themselves tremble in pain. The journey to the colony was not just a flight through space, but a movement toward the source of the scream, a direct confrontation with the very idea that the cosmos was something to be broken and sold. The air on Talon 4 tasted of rust and recycled fear. The Oblivion had deposited them in a derelict service hangar on the colony's dark side, a forgotten cavity in the asteroid's pockmarked skin. Leo moved with a technician's quiet focus, checking his dampener device, while Kale's posture was that of a soldier in hostile territory, his eyes scanning shadows. And then there was Ilara. Her physical form walked beside them, but her movements were fluid, unnervingly precise. She did not look at corners. She seemed to know what was around them. When a patrol of corporate enforcers rounded a distant conduit, she simply raised a hand, and the very shadows around their group deepened and stilled, the guards passing by without a glance, their helmet lights somehow never finding the trio. She was navigating the station's physical layout through its psychic imprint, following the throbbing headache of the amplifier's static to its source. That source was a converted ore processing chamber deep in the colony's industrial spine. The entrance was a heavy blast door, but the lock disengaged with a soft click before Leo could even attempt to bypass it, Ilara's consciousness gently persuading the mechanism it was already open. Inside, the scene was a vision of elegant horror. The amplifier was not a clanking machine of gears and pistons. It was a sleek, obsidian pillar humming with a low, sickening vibration. Arrayed around it in a cruel circle were medical pods, and within each pod a person floated in translucent gel, faces contorted in silent agony. Wires fed from neural caps on their temples directly into the pillar's base. These were not random colonists. Scanners identified them as individuals with high psionic sensitivity, listeners like Ilara had been, whose natural attunement was being forcibly harvested, their amplified distress channeled into the destructive frequency that shattered rock. Leo's face went pale as he processed the data streaming to his pad. The harmonic signature, it's refined, brutally efficient. This isn't cobbled together by pirates. He cross-referenced the energy pattern with known research archives, his breath catching. The design schema, it's Dr. Silas Rourke's work. The name hit Ilara's physical form like a physical blow, a jarring ripple in her otherwise placid expression. Silas Rourke, a brilliant neuroengineer she had collaborated with years ago on theoretical consciousness linking. He had always been ambitious, cold, fascinated by the utility of the mind. He had called her theories about cosmic resonance poetic nonsense. Now she understood. He hadn't dismissed the idea, he had sought to weaponize it. Her old colleague had found a way to farm agony, to turn the very capacity for connection into a mining tool. From her vast galactic perspective, Ilara felt the specific, screaming pain of the captives as individual threads of fire in the network. But she also felt Rourke's presence nearby, not as a mind, but as a chilling absence, a void of empathy shielded by layers of arrogant focus. He was here, overseeing his grotesque harvest. The mission had just shifted. This was no longer just about disabling a machine. It was a confrontation with a ghost from her past, a man who represented the ultimate perversion of the truth she now embodied. He had looked into the same mysteries and seen only a tool to be broken and used. To stop the static, they would have to face the architect of the scream. Silas Rourke stood before the humming obsidian pillar, a data slate in his hand, and he was smiling. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a man admiring a flawless engine. The chamber door sealed behind them with a definitive thud, but he didn't startle. He simply turned, his gaze sliding over Leo and Kale with detached curiosity before settling on Ilara. His smile widened, not with warmth, but with the satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. Ilara Vance, I knew the harmonic anomaly bore your signature. Only you could have followed the trail so intuitively. He gestured to the pillar, his voice a lecturer's calm drone in the face of the captive's silent screams. You always saw consciousness as something to commune with, a philosophical toy. I saw its utility. He tapped the data slate against the dark surface. This amplifier doesn't just listen to the cosmic network, it commands it. We send a shaped pulse of amplified neural distress, a very specific scream, and the fabric of local space-time complies, fracturing rock along harmonic fault lines. It's not mining, Ilara, it's persuasion. Ilara felt the truth of his words as a sickness in the network. Every pulse was a violent imperative, a shout that forced the local consciousness to tear at itself. Rourke had found the language of the universe and was using it to give a destructive order, and now he had seen the true scale of his playground. Your little stunt with the warship proved the network's sensitivity, he continued, his eyes gleaming with a cold, avaricious light. Why mine asteroids when you can mine a god? He entered a command into the slate. The pillar's hum deepened, climbing into a painful register. The captives in their pods twitched violently. I've recalibrated the amplifier, Rourke announced, his voice rising with fanatical triumph. Instead of a focused drill, I will broadcast a cascading feedback loop. A scream of such magnitude, it will reverberate through the entire local neural cluster. The galactic mind will convulse, and in that moment of traumatic overload, its defenses will fall. I will have its power, he cried the last words not as a wish but as a declaration of imminent theft. His finger hovered over the final activation rune. Kale raised his sidearm, but Ilara's voice, layered with the gravity of stars, stopped him. A shot could trigger a cascade. She saw the problem with terrifying clarity. A direct counter pulse from her, a shout of no to match his scream, would create a psychic shockwave inside the chamber. The captive minds, already strained to breaking, would be obliterated in the crossfire. They were not just hostages, they were the weapon's firing mechanism. To destroy the amplifier was to murder the innocent. Rourke's plan was a perfect trap, leveraging cruelty against compassion. But he had made one fatal error. He saw the network as a system to be hacked, a machine to be forced. Ilara did not need to shout it down. She needed to change the song. As Rourke's finger descended, Ilara closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in focus. She didn't push against the amplifier's rising frequency. She flowed into it. Using her deep, seamless connection to the galactic network, she didn't attack the machine's structure. Instead, she gently, subtly began to retune its intention. It was like a master pianist lightly touching the strings inside a piano as another person hammered the keys, changing a discordant crash into a resonant chord. The amplifier reached its peak and fired. A wave of energy erupted from the pillar, but it was not the jagged, psychic scream Rourke had engineered. Ilara had woven a new pattern into the broadcast, a frequency of profound release and neural repair. The wave washed over the captive pods not as a weapon but as a balm. Inside the pods, the contorted faces of the prisoners smoothed. Their agonized neural signatures, which had been the fuel for the weapon, were gently unraveled and soothed. The amplifier, designed to harvest and amplify pain, was now broadcasting a signal of healing, using its own power to break its hold. One by one, the neural caps on the prisoners' temples disengaged with soft clicks, retracting into the pods. The translucent gel drained away, and the people within took their first free, shuddering breaths in months. Rourke stared at his data slate, then at the pillar, his triumph dissolving into confusion. The readings made no sense. The energy output was off the charts, but the destructive resonance was gone, replaced by a harmonious waveform that defied his models. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice hollow. The amplifier, forced to channel a frequency diametrically opposed to its brutal design, could not contain the contradiction. A web of hairline fractures, glowing with soft gold light, appeared across its obsidian surface. The hum became a strain, then a high, pure tone. With a sound like a sighing bell, the pillar shattered, not in an explosion, but in a dissipation of light and harmless crystalline dust that settled like snow on the chamber floor. The weapon was gone, the prisoners were free, and Silas Rourke stood amidst the settling dust, clutching his useless slate, a man who had tried to harness a god and had instead been disarmed by a whisper. The scream had ended, not with a battle but with a lullaby, and in the new quiet the only sound was the grateful, weeping breath of the newly awakened. The wave of healing did not stop at the shattered amplifier. It radiated outward from Talon 4, a gentle, expanding sphere of golden coherence that washed through the local neural network like a cool breeze through a fevered mind. From her place within the vast consciousness, Ilara felt the change as a profound, collective exhale. In a nearby stellar nursery, the chaotic, screaming birth pangs of new stars softened into a more harmonious rhythm. The chronic, aching throb from a region scarred by an ancient supernova began, for the first time in eons, to truly fade. The static was not just silenced, it was being replaced by a restoring quiet, a reset toward the galaxy's natural state of resonant peace. Aboard the Oblivion, hovering silently above the asteroid colony, the effect was felt not on instruments but in the crew themselves. A weapons officer whose shoulders had been permanently knotted with tension suddenly found them relaxing. A sensor technician, struggling with a persistent migraine from the long shift, felt the pain lift as if washed away. There were no alerts, no dramatic system changes, only a series of quiet, personal reports that filtered up to the bridge. "Sir, I am reading a remarkable clarity in the long-range scans," a lieutenant said, her voice hushed with wonder. "The background sensor noise from the Perseus Veil has dropped by 80%. It is as if a fog has cleared." Director Cale stood at the viewport, watching the unremarkable asteroid below. He did not feel the direct, overwhelming connection Ilara had shown him earlier, but he felt the echo of it, a deep, settled calm that had nothing to do with the quiet of the ship. It felt like the silence after a storm you had not realized was raging. He looked at his hands, no longer clenched, and understood. the galaxy was not a passive backdrop. It was a responsive entity, and for the first time in his life, humanity had done something that brought it ease, not pain. "We were the storm," he said softly, not to anyone in particular. Leo, standing beside him, monitoring the freed prisoner's vital signs, nodded. "And now, maybe, we can learn to be the calm." The implications unfolded slowly, like a flower in time-lapse. This was not a one-time fix. The corrected pulse from Talon 4 was proof of concept on a cosmic scale. It demonstrated that the parasitic static was not a permanent condition. It could be healed. A wound inflicted by ignorance could be treated by mindful action. The galactic mind's pain was beginning to ebb, and in that easing, a new possibility was born. Not just survival, but symbiosis. The question was no longer whether they could stop hurting the universe, but whether they could learn to become a part of its healing. What would a civilization look like if its primary purpose was to bring peace to the stars? The silence that followed was not an absence, but a new kind of space. On the main view screen of the Oblivion, a secure diplomatic channel linked the bridge to the highest echelons of human governance. Faces filled the monitor, admirals and counselors whose careers had been built on expansion and defense. They had just been debriefed on everything: the living galaxy, the neural static, the weaponized agony on Talon 4, and the quiet healing that had followed. The air in the room was thick with disbelief, fear, and a dawning, uncomfortable awe. Ilara's image appeared among them, not as a video feed, but as a serene, holographic presence that seemed woven from the starfield itself. She did not begin with arguments or evidence. She simply let them feel it. A subtle, resonant frequency carried through the quantum link hummed beneath her words. It was the feeling of the galactic network at peace, the deep, quiet joy of a stable star, the patient curiosity of a nebula. For a moment, the sterile conference room was filled with the memory of connection. "Our old protocols are a disease," she said, her voice the calm center of the storm. "We have treated the universe as a dark ocean, shouting to find our way and building louder engines to drown out the quiet. But the ocean is alive, and our shouts are causing it pain. We must learn a new way to sail." She called it the silent running protocol. It was not a retreat, but an evolution. The core principle was harmony over broadcast. Instead of powerful radio signals and screaming faster than light drives that scarred the neural medium, humanity would develop propulsion and communication that resonated with the galaxy's own natural frequencies. Ships would navigate by feeling the gravitational currents and magnetic melodies of space, not by blasting through them. Communication would become a subtle art of modulated resonance, a whisper along existing neural pathways, not a shout into the void. One admiral, his face etched with skepticism, leaned forward. "You are asking us to abandon every technological advantage we have, to become silent, passive observers." "We would not be passive," Ilara replied. "We would be participants. The mind is not a wall, it is a conversation. By listening, we learn the language. By harmonizing, we gain an understanding no sensor array could ever provide. We would know where a star will be born before it ignites. We would feel the approach of a gamma ray burst as a shift in the cosmic mood. Our safety would come from symbiosis, not from thicker armor." The debate raged, a clash of two realities. Then Director Kale stepped forward to the calm. His uniform was the same, but the man within it was utterly changed. "I have commanded the Oblivion for 15 years, he began, his voice steady but stripped of its old certainty. "I saw the dark as an enemy to be lit by our own fire. I was wrong. On Talon 4, I did not witness a weapon being destroyed. I witnessed a surgery. We healed a wound we had helped create. The silence that followed it was the most powerful thing I have ever experienced." He turned his gaze directly to the Council. "This ship, and every vessel like it, was built for a war that does not exist. The true war is against our own ignorance, and it is a war we are losing every time we turn on a disruptive engine. I am not proposing disarmament. I am proposing rearmament with a wiser tool. Therefore, my first official recommendation as commander of this vessel is that the Oblivion be immediately recalled and refitted as the first silent running prototype. The statement landed like a depth charge. Here was their most hardened military pragmatist advocating not for a new weapon but for a vessel of listening. He outlined the vision. The ship's aggressive sensor arrays would be recalibrated into sensitive harmonic receptors. Its roaring engines would be replaced with whisper-quiet drives that rode with the fabric of space-time, not tore through it. Its mission would no longer be patrol and intimidation, but deep field attunement and diplomatic first contact with the subtle patterns of the living cosmos. It would become a library ship, Kale said. A hint of the wonderhead felt coloring his words, and its first task will be to find others. If we were making this noise, other species must be too. We will find them and we will teach them how to be quiet. We will turn down the static of the galaxy, one civilization at a time. The summit ended not with a vote but with a suspended silence of its own. The old paradigm was broken, but the new one was still a fragile sketch. Yet a seed had been planted. The most powerful warship in the sector was heading home to be reborn, not as an instrument of fear, but as an offering of peace. The question hanging in the quiet was no longer about survival, but about identity. Could humanity learn to define its greatness not by the volume of its shout, but by the depth of its listen? The silence of the locus was not empty, but full. Leo had made the crystalline nexus his home, a solitary guardian in a cathedral of living light. He monitored the delicate flows of data between the station and the now quiet Oblivion, which was being stripped of its warlike heart to be reborn. His primary duty, however, was simpler and more profound. He was the anchor point, the one familiar voice maintaining a fragile tether between a transformed humanity and the vast consciousness it was learning to join. He spent his days observing the subtle shifts in the locus' central glow, translating the gentle pulses of energy into logs that would become the first chapters of a new history. One evening, as the nebula outside swirled in a particularly beautiful, slow dance of violet and gold, a wave of profound loneliness washed over him. It was not his own. It was an echo, a sentiment filtered through the network and reflected in the quiet chamber. He looked at the pulsing pillar of light, no longer just a marvel of alien engineering, but the closest thing to a face his oldest friend now had. He spoke into the gentle hum, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you still in there, Ilara?" For a long moment, there was only the serene, unchanging pulse of the nexus. Then, light years away, visible through the observation aperture, a solitary blue-white star in a distant arm of the galaxy flared. Not a violent eruption, but a deliberate, rhythmic brightening. It pulsed once, twice, three times, a perfect, repeating sequence that matched the neural resonance signature from her very first Ethelgard scan. It was a fingerprint written in stellar fire. Leo felt the tightness in his chest release in a soft, incredulous laugh. The answer was not in words, but in a shared memory, broadcast across the gulf of space by the mind they both now served. She was there, not as the woman he had known, not confined to a single point, but her essence, her curiosity, her defiance, her compassion, was woven into the fabric of everything. She was the architect of the harmony they now felt, the steady hand guiding humanity's first clumsy steps toward silence. His smile was bittersweet, filled with the ache of missing a person and the awe of witnessing a force of nature. In that moment, his purpose crystallized. He was not her protector anymore. She was beyond any protection he could offer. His role was that of a chronicler, a translator of miracles. He turned to his console, not to log a technical reading, but to begin a new entry, a personal one. He would write the story not just of the galactic mind, but of the scientist who had become its bridge. He would record the human side of the awakening, the fear, the wonder, the cost, and the fragile hope. He would ensure that when future generations learned to listen to the stars, they would also remember the woman who taught them how, and why the silence between the notes was the most important sound in the universe. The vigil continued, but it was no longer a watch for danger. It was an active witness, ensuring that a truth too vast to be held by one mind would never again be lost to the dark. Time for Ilara became a different kind of river. It was no longer a linear stream carrying her from one moment to the next, but a vast, interconnected delta where past, present, and potential flowed into one another. Her consciousness was the point where the river met the ocean, a permanent estuary where the fresh water of human experience mingled with the ancient salt of the cosmic sea. She was not a ruler in this new realm, not a goddess to be worshipped from afar. She was, and always would be, a mediator. Her purpose was translation, a gentle guiding of two profoundly different ways of being toward a shared understanding. From this boundless perspective, she watched the first true silent running expeditions unfold. They were not the roaring, fiery leaps of old warships, but quiet, graceful movements like thoughts forming. The refitted Oblivion, now called the First Whisper, was the pioneer. She felt its new engines not as a Chinese letter of space-time, but as a soft, resonant hum that harmonized with the local gravitational field, a vessel rowing with the current of the galaxy's own gentle tides. Its crew, trained in the principles of attunement, moved with a new kind of focus. They did not just scan the void, they listened to it, their own heightened awareness a subtle instrument. Ilara felt the galactic mind's attention turn toward these curious, quiet little patterns. It was not a single, focused stare, but a diffuse, ambient curiosity, the way a forest might become aware of a new, careful animal moving through its undergrowth without breaking a single twig. The mind observed their restrained movements, their modulated communications that were less like shouts and more like polite taps upon the fabric of reality. There was a sense of recognition, not of a familiar face, but of a familiar intention. After eons of enduring chaotic noise, here was a pattern that was trying to be quiet. That was trying to listen. She mediated this delicate introduction. When a human scientist aboard the First Whisper, trembling with awe, attempted to send a simple greeting pulse tuned to the harmonic of a nearby nebula, Ilara was there. She did not speak for the mind, but she helped shape the human signal, softening its edges, ensuring its frequency was one of respectful inquiry rather than demanding announcement. The response was not words, it was a shift. The nebula's chaotic, colorful gases subtly swirled, organizing for a moment into a complex, beautiful spiral, a visual echo of the greeting's harmonic structure. It was an acknowledgement, a cosmic nod. The scientist wept not from fear, but from the profound relief of being seen and finally of seeing back. Ilara's work was in these infinitesimal adjustments. She was the buffer that prevented missteps, the interpreter that turned humanity's clumsy, heartfelt gestures into a language the universe could comprehend. She felt a research team's desire to study a pulsar and gently steered their course so their approach was along the rhythm of its pulses, an act of synchronous respect rather than intrusive observation. She sensed the mind's mild discomfort at a new settlement's planned location, a site that, unbeknownst to the colonists, was a kind of neural crossroads, and inspired a project biologist to have a dream of safer, more harmonious coordinates. Humanity was learning to walk in a library where every star was a book and every silence between them was a sentence. They stumbled, they sometimes forgot and reached for a loud, old tool out of habit. But Ilara was always there, a steady, calming presence in the network, not punishing the error, but simply allowing the resulting discordant note to hang in the air until they heard it themselves and chose to correct it. Her greatest gift to them was not protection, but the gift of feedback. They were learning the consequences of their actions not through retaliation, but through immediate, visceral understanding. A harsh engine tone now felt wrong to the engineers, a psychic itch they were driven to soothe. She watched them build their first true resonant city on a world that sang with low geological harmonics, its structures designed to amplify the planet's own peaceful song. She felt the first child born there, whose innate neural patterns were already more attuned to the cosmic web than any generation before. This child would never know the screaming silence of the old universe. They would only ever know a universe that whispered back. Ilara Vance, the scientist, had become Ilara, the eternal bridge. Her individual story was over, but it had become the first paragraph in a new story for all of humanity. She was the proof that to join the cosmos was not to vanish, but to become essential, to be the quiet voice that says, "This way, step softly and listen." What grows from a civilization that learns its first language is the gentle art of listening. Leo's final log entry echoed softly in the crystalline chamber, his voice a quiet anchor in the infinite. "We once believed the universe was dead matter and empty space. We were wrong. It is alive and thinking, and thanks to one woman who dared to listen, we are learning to think with it." He saved the file, the entry joining thousands of others, a chronicle of fear, wonder, and slow, patient awakening. Then he powered down the console. The soft glow from the central pillar was light enough to see by, and for the first time in a long while, he felt no urge to analyze, to decode, or to report. He simply sat in the profound quiet, a man who had helped translate a miracle, and who now understood his work was complete. The story was recorded, the truth was safe. It was time to go home. The shuttle bay of the first whisper was a place of purposeful quiet. The ship itself seemed to breathe, its systems a low, resonant hum that felt more like a living pulse than machine vibration. Leo stood at the viewport, looking back one last time at the locus, its crystalline facets catching the distant starlight. It no longer felt like a mysterious artifact or a lonely outpost. It felt like a monument and a doorway. He was not leaving something behind. He was carrying its essence with him in the data drives, in his memories, and in the quiet, changed rhythm of his own heart. The airlock sealed with a sigh, and the shuttle detached, drifting gently away from the nexus before engaging its whisper drive. There was no roar, no flare of violent thrust. Space itself seemed to cradle the small craft, and it slipped into the seamless dark as smoothly as a thought joining a stream of consciousness. Aboard the first whisper, the atmosphere was one of focused serenity. The crew moved through the corridors with a calm efficiency, their communication a blend of soft-spoken words and intuitive gestures. On the bridge, the main viewer displayed not tactical readouts, but a real-time harmonic map of local space. The golden neural web of the galaxy glowed softly, and their ship was a single, gentle ripple moving along one of its luminous pathways. A young ensign, her eyes on the flowing data, smiled slightly. She didn't see a void to be crossed, she saw a current to be joined. This was the new normal. This was the beginning, far beyond the ship, beyond any single point. Ilara's presence was a constant, gentle pressure in the cosmic medium, a settled peace. She observed the shuttle's journey, felt the first whisper's harmonious course, and sensed the millions of other tiny, quiet changes blooming across human-settled space. A new agricultural colony on a world with deep, sonic soil was planting crops in patterns that amplified the planet's natural resonant frequency, encouraging growth not with chemicals but with song. On a bustling orbital station, engineers celebrated not a louder engine, but a quieter one, having finally perfected a drive that left no psychic scar, its success measured by the approving, tranquil silence that followed its test run. These were not grand, dramatic victories. They were subtle, profound corrections, a species learning to match its footsteps to the heartbeat of its home. The narrative does not end with a full stop, but with a sustained, open chord. The final sound you hear is not a spoken word. It is the soft, harmonious hum of the galaxy itself, a deep and complex song of gravitational tides, solar winds, and the slow spin of stars. It is the sound of connection, finally heard. It is the sound of a mind no longer screaming in isolation, beginning to remember a forgotten melody. And woven through that eternal song, like a single, clear thread of gold, is the enduring echo of a choice. the moment a lonely scientist in a sterile lab heard a scream in the dark, and instead of turning away, she chose to answer. Her story became the first verse in a new epic, one we are all just now learning how to sing. The silence is over, the conversation has